Even more revealing to me was the testimony Marco Rubio gave today at his confirmation hearing, where he was treated very respectfully. There are going to be a lot of Democrats voting for him, which I think speaks volumes. They won't be voting for Tulsi Gabbard, but they'll be voting for Marco Rubio. They'll definitely be voting for Elise Stefanik. I don't even know if she'll get any no votes. But one of the things that Marco Rubio has been very vocal and outspoken on throughout his whole career is he is a hawk. He's with Lindsey Graham and John McCain when he was around, and that whole crew, in constantly defending the not just justifiability, but necessity and the wisdom of the United States going and overthrowing governments and invading countries. And he has been a hardcore, outspoken supporter of U.S. support for Ukraine, saying we have to win this war, we have to drive the Russians out, we can't let the Russians win. And that's clearly at odds with what Trump wants to do with the war in Ukraine. He wants to end the war in Ukraine too. Another war that has gone on for almost 4 years that Joe Biden not only didn't end, but kept fueling and instigating. And I found it so notable what Marco Rubio said when he was asked about Ukraine and the way in which he abandoned his previous position and conformed what he's now saying to what he knows is Donald Trump's view on Ukraine. Listen to this. This is when he's being asked by Jeanine Sheehan, who's the Democratic senator from New Hampshire and an absolute extremist when it comes to supporting Ukraine over Russia. It's really, a lot of these Democratic senators have this, they're people with the Ukrainian flags in their office. They've taken this on as their main cause. So she's asking Marco Rubio what he thinks about the war in Ukraine, and listen to what he said.
Can you talk about how your views on Ukraine have developed and where you are now, and what you think is important for us to do in order to ensure that there's the strongest possible negotiating position if Ukraine and Russia do get to the negotiating table?
Sure. First, let me point out, and although I'll still speak to my view of the process, that I voted against that bill because I said I would not vote for a bill unless it addressed the crisis at our southern border as part of the overall arrangement. That was not done, and so I voted against it. That said, here's my view of a situation. Once this war became what we now know it is, and that is a war of attrition, a stalemate, a protracted conflict, the dynamic on that situation has changed. It has. And I believe, and I think that this echoes with the president. Let me first echo the president's words and what he said in an interview about a year ago. He was asked about the war in Ukraine. He says, I want the dying to stop. I want people to stop dying. I want the killing to stop. And frankly, I don't know how anyone could say they don't. The destruction that Ukraine is undergoing is extraordinary. It's going to take a generation to rebuild it. Millions of Ukrainians no longer live in Ukraine. And the disruption, that means how many of them are going to come back, and what are they going to come back to? Even as I speak to you now, the Ukrainian infrastructure and their energy infrastructure is being decimated in ways that are going to cost hundreds of billions of dollars to rebuild over the next decades. So this is an important conflict, and I think it should be the official position of the United States that this war should be brought to an end. And the question becomes...
Now, this is nothing like what we've heard in Washington from both parties over the past 4 years. 3 full years going to the 4th year. Nothing like it. And one of the things that I do think is quite notable about Donald Trump, quite unique about him, is that in general, when Washington talks about wars, especially wars that they're just funding and treating as a proxy war, but even sometimes wars where our troops are deployed, it's always done in this very abstract, bloodless way. There's a lot of sitting around in think tanks, debating strategy and tactics and the geopolitics of the war aims and war objectives, and there's almost never any acknowledgement of the central fact of war, which is that massive amounts of blood is shed and huge numbers of people die tragically. That's the reason to avoid war, is because of how much life it extinguishes. And Trump, alone among major political figures, certainly among presidents in my lifetime, every time he talks about war, he begins with and talks passionately of the life that is being lost, the number of people being killed. It is something very notable. He doesn't just do it in passing. It's not lip service. He starts with that as the central fact for why these wars are hideous. He is just somebody who hasn't been steeped in Washington speak about military conflict for decades, and therefore still reads these reports and is most struck by what he should be most struck by, but why most people should be most struck by when talking about war, which is in Ukraine, the loss of life is enormous and incredibly tragic. An entire generation of Ukrainian men, 2 generations of Ukrainian men, have been either extinguished or crippled, or they fled Ukraine to avoid being killed as cannon fodder on the front lines. And major parts of Ukraine are destroyed. Their energy infrastructure, their buildings, their cities. And of course, the West is going to rebuild those all. And the longer the war goes on, the more blood this is going to shed. And that's why, to hear Marco Rubio, of all people, talking this way and saying that the official position of the United States government should be not, we're going to get total victory against Russia, the way DC and every sector and every crevice was saying for 2+ years, but saying that the official position of the United States government is that this war has to end and end as soon as possible to avoid the loss of life. That's Donald Trump speaking. And you see Marco Rubio adapting himself to Trump's position. Let's hear the rest of this. Now the question that Rubio will raise is, okay, we want the war to end, but how is it going to end? Because remember, at the beginning of the war, and for 2 years into it, the United States and NATO and EU countries and the militarists and warmongers and the Green Party in Germany and the Labour Party in the UK and the Tories in the UK and the Macron government in France, they all define victory in the maximalist sense, which is we can only win if we drive out every Russian troop from every inch of Ukrainian soil, including Crimea. And they said we cannot let Russia win this war, which will happen if the war ends with Russia controlling or occupying any part of Ukraine. And it was never a realistic definition of victory. They were never going to achieve that. The Russians would have used nuclear weapons before they gave up Crimea because of how existential they perceive the access to the Black Sea and to the Crimean Peninsula is, that they would never allow NATO there, ever. And they were never going to give up the provinces in eastern Ukraine that they had already been effectively occupying even before 2022 by arming the Russian separatists, the Russian ethnic Russian separatists in the Donbass. And then when they gave all that life and blood and money and treasure to occupy those parts of Ukraine, of course they're not going to voluntarily leave, and the West has proven they cannot dislodge them. And so the war can only end in a way that is a Russian victory, as NATO and the US stupidly defined it when they were all caught up in this war fervor around Ukraine and how we're going to drive the Russians out and save Ukrainian democracy. And there were a handful of scholars like Stephen Wald and John Mearsheimer and Jeffrey Sachs, people we've had on our show before, many others, but not many, not many, others, but not many, who are pointing out that no matter how well the Ukrainian fights, no matter how much we earn them, the sheer size difference alone will mean that Russia can never win. That Russia can never lose, rather, that Ukraine can never win. It's just a question of time and how many people die before the war is over. And as Professor Mearsheimer often put it, Ukraine will be left with a rump state because Russia is now occupying and controlling roughly 25% of what had been Ukrainian territory before 2014. And none of that is going to change. But you would be called a Russian agent for pointing out any of that until very recently. And now you have people like Marco Rubio admitting the reality and saying, here's how this war has to end.
Brought to an end. And the question becomes, what role can we play? And I think the first is by making that abundantly clear. And my differences with the Biden administration throughout this process is that they never clearly delineated what the end goal of the conflict was. What exactly were we funding? What exactly were we putting money towards? And on many occasions it sounded like however much it takes for however long it takes. That is not a realistic or prudent position. The truth of the matter is that in this conflict, there is no way Russia takes all of Ukraine. The Ukrainians are too brave and fight too hard, and the country is too big. That's not going to happen. It's also unrealistic to believe that somehow a nation the size of Ukraine, no matter how incompetent and no matter how much damage the Russian Federation has suffered as a result of this invasion, there's no way Ukraine is also going to push these people all the way back to where they were on the eve of the invasion, just given the size dynamic. I saw a quote recently, and I wish I could attribute to who it was, but the quote was, and I think it was very wise, where they said the problem that Ukraine is facing is not that they're running out of money, it's that they're running out of Ukrainians. There's a size differential here that's important. Now, what Vladimir Putin has done is unacceptable. There's no doubt doubt about it, but this war has to end. And I think it should be the official policy of the United States that we want to see it end. Now, what that master plan looks like is going to be hard work. This is not going to be an easy endeavor, but it's going to require bold diplomacy. And my hope is that it could begin with some ceasefire. And in order to achieve objectives like the one that needs to occur in Ukraine, it is important for everyone to be realistic. There will have to be concessions made by the Russian Federation, but also by the Ukrainians, and the United States has lent itself there. It's also important that there be some balance on both sides. In essence, it will be difficult to achieve this objective of a ceasefire and ultimately a peace settlement unless both sides have leverage.
I can't stress enough how remarkable of a abandonment that is from what not just both parties, but Marco Rubio himself has been saying. Their critique of the Biden administration was not that Biden failed to define victory or the war aims in a clearly delineated enough manner. You can't criticize Biden for that. Victory was defined in a very clearly delineated way. What I just went through. Victory was the expulsion of every Russian troop from every inch of Ukrainian territory, including Crimea. And anything short of that was not victory. If anything, the critique of Marco Rubio and his fellow Republicans and Democrats of the Biden administration was that, if anything, they weren't doing enough to help Ukraine. They weren't giving enough. They weren't giving enough money, enough weapons. They were limiting the use of American weapons out of fear, I guess, which is an invalid fear in their eyes, of escalating a war with Russia, the largest nuclear power on the planet. Everything Marco Rubio just said here was the province of people who were accused of being Russian agents at the beginning, but now he's acknowledging, and again, I think it's because he's required to, because this is what Trump thinks and wants, that A, this war has to end quickly, and B, they're finally accepting that any resolution to this war is necessarily going to include concessions to Russia, that they will, whatever you call it, occupy a significant portion of Ukraine, whether you call it a semi-autonomous region or some frozen zone, or maybe they're going to want to try and save face and not acknowledge that this is now something that the Russians control, but in effect, that's what it's going to be, and Marco Rubio is saying that. I think you're seeing here, in some part, the inevitable acknowledgement that the war in Ukraine is a failure. There's nobody who denies that except maybe Zelensky and a couple of the people in Berlin in the Green Party and some of the Labour and Tory hawks in London. But outside of that small circle, everybody understands that victory is not going to be achieved. It's just remarkable to hear Marco Rubio say this as somebody who comes from that hawkish part of the Republican Party and who's about to become Secretary of State. I think in a lot of ways it reflects Donald Trump's worldview and the fact that, more importantly, people like Marco Rubio know that they have to at least create the appearance, if not submit to the reality, that regardless of what position they're taking, regardless of how credible they're perceived to be in Washington, they need to be carrying out Donald Trump's agenda, or else Trump will be alienated. And he can disempower anybody at any moment that he wants. You have to keep Trump happy in Trump world if you want to wield any power. And this is why I've been very skeptical of this idea that every single Trump appointee signals exactly what the Trump administration is going to be, as though all of these people who are being appointed have full autonomy to carry out their own agenda. I don't think that's the case. And at least when it comes to Ukraine, what Marco Rubio is now saying is very encouraging in terms of reality finally setting into Washington. I absolutely think that Trump wants to begin his administration by being able to boast about the fact that he resolved the war in Israel and Gaza and the war between Russia and Ukraine. Both wars that the Biden administration fueled and funded and paid for and armed. Now, whether we end up in a conflict with Iran or some conflict with China, all of which is possible, I'm not predicting that. But I do know that Trump went through 4 years as president. I've pointed this out many times. The reality is that he did not get the United States involved directly in a new war or indirectly involved in a new war. The only president in decades for whom that's true. You'd be foolish to try and predict the future, but these signs are obviously very good ones in terms of Trump's clear desire to avoid new wars that go under his ledger and allowing the people he's appointing to pursue their own agenda and subverting his, as opposed to doing what Marco Rubio is clearly doing here, which is abandoning his own view and catering it to Donald Trump. So I think there's a lot of insight here into what the Trump administration is going to be before it even begins in which is 5 days from now. There is evidence that suggests that drinking 2 to 3 cups in the morning of coffee could slash your risk of death by 29% and cut your chances of heart complications by nearly half. But that's not the only benefit you get from drinking your coffee. Coffee can also be helpful in fighting censorship while tasting excellent. That's why I've always been proud to have 1775 coffee as a supporter of our show. This isn't just coffee. It's like a rebellion in every cup, in every sip. It's handpicked at high altitudes and sourced from single origin farms. 1775 coffee delivers bold flavor and real benefits that Starbucks crappy sugar company can't touch. Boost your metabolism, protect your heart, and stay sharper than a debate on free speech. Whether it's beans, grounds, or pods, every sip of 1775 coffee takes a stand against a sugar-packed mediocrity. Head to 1775coffee.com. Use the promo code Glenn for 15% off and improve your mornings with coffee that fuels bold flavor, uncompromising quality, and helps Rumble in the free speech fight that it stands for every day. Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.